Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here for this one.
I'm really glad you could join us for this custom-tailored deep dive today. We have a mission that, well, it might fundamentally alter how you look at the advertisements popping up on your phone.
Or the clothes hanging in your closet.
Right, exactly. Even the food sitting in your pantry. We are diving into a book by Marco Pichierri, which is called Nostalgia Marketing: Consumer Behavior and Advertising Effectiveness.
But we should be clear right from the jump. We are not treating this as a simple business review
No, definitely not.
or some kind of corporate marketing how-to guide. Books for us are just entry points.
They're a way in. And our mission today is to map the primary system at play here, because identity equals systems. We're going to examine how nostalgia operates as a highly engineered communication technology.
Which is a totally different way to look at it.
It is. We're looking at an infrastructure that is designed to convert your memory, your identity, and really your deep desire for belonging into predictable, monetizable outcomes for consumer and institutional structures.
Treating nostalgia as a communication technology it's a radical shift in perspective for most people.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are socially conditioned to view nostalgia as a purely private, organic emotion.
Just a feeling you have.
Right. It's a warm feeling that washes over you when you hear a song from high school or smell a specific brand of sunscreen. But when you look at it systemically, you start to see a massive, highly calibrated infrastructure hidden right in plain sight.
And I want to challenge your assumptions right out of the gate, because I had to challenge my own when reading through these sources. Think about your daily life.
Yeah, the everyday stuff.
You might assume that buying a retro packaged soda at the grocery store.
Or spending your weekend binge-watching an 80s-themed television show.
Right, or throwing on a throwback sports jersey. You think it's just a quirky personal preference. You tell yourself, I just like the aesthetic.
Or, it reminds me of being a kid.
Exactly. But what if that warm, fuzzy feeling is not entirely your own? What if it is the intended result of a meticulously designed persuasion infrastructure?
To really see that infrastructure, we have to establish a baseline definition of what nostalgia actually is, because the concept has undergone a really fascinating evolution.
It didn't always mean what we think it means today.
Not at all. The word itself has Greek roots. It combines nostos, which means returning home, and algos, which translates to pain or ache.
So it literally translates to the pain of wanting to go home. That sounds incredibly heavy.
It was incredibly heavy.
Yeah.
In early psychological literature dating back centuries, nostalgia was actually treated as a medical condition.
A literal disease.
Yes, it was a severe, bittersweet longing for home that afflicted soldiers, sailors, displaced people. It was viewed as a physical and psychological ailment.
Ooh.
But as society evolved, the definition expanded and softened. Scholars began to observe it as a sociological phenomenon rather than a medical diagnosis.
So it became less about an agonizing ache for a specific physical home and more about a general interest in elements belonging to the past.
Right. It morphed into an individual's tendency to look back to and actively desire an idealized version of history.
The journey from a literal medical diagnosis to a generalized longing for an idealized past is wild. And the source text points out that by the early 1990s, the consumer behavior domain had fully recognized this shift.
The corporate world saw this sociological phenomenon and realized it could be utilized.
They saw it as an anchor of stability in turbulent times. It evolved from a human coping mechanism into a highly convincing promotional appeal.
And once an emotion can be reliably categorized as an anchor of stability, it ceases to be just an emotion.
It becomes a tool.
Exactly. It becomes a tool. And that is what we are mapping out today. We're going to look at this system layer by layer.
We'll start with how this feeling is actively designed and constructed by marketers.
Then we'll move into the incentive architecture.
Right, why major institutions are practically forced to default to the past. From there, we will trace the real-world behavioral outcomes this produces across several very different domains.
And finally, we'll look at the feedback loops that ensure this system persists so deeply in our culture and reconnect it to the larger systems at play.
So let's start with that first layer, the design of nostalgia marketing, or what we might call constructing the past. Because reading through the analysis of how these campaigns are built, the biggest realization for me was that nostalgia marketing does not actually sell history.
No, it's not interested in historical fact at all.
It sells an idealized past. It is a curated, highly edited narrative.
The curation aspect is vital here. Russell W. Belk wrote the foreword for the book, and he provides two distinct literary frameworks that perfectly illustrate how we interact with the past.
The Shakespeare and Proust comparison.
Yes, the first framework he offers is Shakespearean. He points to Shakespeare's Sonnet 30, which actually features the phrase, remembrance of things past.
I feel like I've heard that phrase associated with a different author, though.
You definitely have. It was famously used as the original English translation for the title of Marcel Proust's magnum opus. But staying with Shakespeare for a moment,
Sure.
the Shakespearean view of nostalgia is somber. It is focused heavily on loss, on wasted time, and unfulfilled goals. It's a melancholic focus on what is gone.
Belk references the scholar Susan Stewart here, right?
He does.
That-
Stewart describes this type of nostalgia as sadness without an object.
Because it's an inauthentic longing. The past it desperately seeks never actually existed in the pristine way the person remembers it.
Spot on. It is essentially misremembrance used to validate a tenuous or unhappy present self.
So the Shakespearean framework is almost like looking at an old photo of an ex-partner and convincing yourself the relationship was perfect.
Totally ignoring all the terrible fights you had.
Right. It's a fabricated sadness based on an edited memory.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And Bell contrasts that melancholic misremembrance with the Proustian framework.
Which is the more modern translation of Proust's work.
Exactly. The more accurate translation is in search of lost time. That slight shift in phrasing changes the entire psychological framing.
Because in search of implies motion. It sounds like an active mission rather than just sitting around feeling sad about wasted time.
It is an active mission. The Proustian framework envisions nostalgia as a positive, forward-looking quest. It is a search for self-discovery.
So in this view, the past is a rich record of the joys, the sorrows, and the foundational experiences that make us who we are today.
Looking backward is not an exercise in mourning. It is a way to consolidate your sense of self in the present.
And this positive, self-affirming view is the exact psychological foundation that modern marketers are trying to trigger.
Yes, and Bill ties this positive quest to a brilliant concept he calls the extended self.
I found this fascinating.
It really is. He makes the case that our identities do not stop at the boundaries of our physical bodies. Who you are as a person stretches outward.
It includes your possessions, your pets, the physical places you have lived.
And crucially, the brands and objects that remind you of your past. We define our own identities through physical artifacts that trigger interpersonal nostalgia.
When marketing campaigns operationalize the past, they are targeting that extended self directly. But they do so by offering a stabilizing narrative.
They rely heavily on the cognitive quirk of selective recall.
Because human memory is naturally faulty, isn't it? It tends to filter out the bad and amplify the good.
Marketers leverage this biological tendency to create emotionally safe reference points. They strip away the complexities.
The daily traumas, the mundane boredom of actual history.
What you are left with is a pristine, curated meaning that drastically reduces the consumer's feelings of uncertainty in the present.
That concept of reducing uncertainty is massive. And what really caught my attention in the text is how this mechanism operates on two completely different levels.
Personal nostalgia and historical nostalgia.
Right. Personal nostalgia makes total sense to me. That is when a brand taps into your actual lived past.
So if you were a teenager in the 1990s, an advertisement featuring dial-up internet sound
Or a specific 90s fashion trend.
hits you personally. It triggers your own autobiographical memory.
But historical nostalgia operates on a completely different set of rules. Historical nostalgia is a socially conveyed past that preceded the individual's life entirely.
So marketers can successfully leverage a 1950s diner aesthetic
Or a 1970s disco soundtrack.
to sell a product to someone who was born in the year 2005.
Which is objectively strange when you stop and think about it. How can someone experience a deep, yearning nostalgia for a decade they never existed in?
It works because historical nostalgia proves that the emotion is not actually dependent on autobiographical memory. It is about the idea of a simpler time.
It's a cultural fantasy that is inherited, not experienced.
The text points to the massive success of the entertainment industry in utilizing this, specifically highlighting the television series Stranger Things.
That show is a masterclass in this. It is heavily tied to 1980s brand partnerships.
Eggo waffles, classic Coca-Cola, mall culture.
And it evokes an incredibly potent collective nostalgia, even for millions of viewers who were born decades after the 1980s ended.
We see this manifestation everywhere, across consumer goods today.
Nintendo, Sega, Sony.
Releasing miniaturized versions of their classic gaming consoles.
Nokia rebooting the legendary 3310 cell phone 17 years after its original debut.
Capitalizing on the collective memory of a time before smartphones dominated our attention.
Pepsi and Mountain Dew releasing throwback packaging that imitates their original iterations from decades ago.
It is an endless wave of reboots and retro packaging. But to understand why these triggers are so potent right now, we have to look at the macro-environmental factors discussed in the sources.
Because collective nostalgia does not just happen in a vacuum.
No, it is frequently triggered by shared negative macro events.
And the most glaring recent example the text highlights is the 2019 to 2021 COVID pandemic.
The pandemic was a period of immense global anxiety
Physical isolation.
and profound uncertainty about the future. The text references a study demonstrating that during this specific period, a vast majority of consumers actively sought comfort in past-related content.
People were retreating into television shows, movies, and music from their youth.
I know I was.
I remember doing exactly that. I found myself rewatching sitcoms I had already seen 5 times instead of starting anything new.
Because you just wanted the predictable comfort of a story where you already knew the ending.
That is the exact psychological mechanism at work. When the present environment becomes threatening, highly complex, or unstable, the idealized past serves as a psychological sanctuary.
It is a predictable space where the outcomes are already known. Marketers understand that when collective anxiety spikes, the demand for this psychological sanctuary skyrockets.
So we have established that human beings have this deep-seated, psychologically driven desire for a safe past, especially when the present feels chaotic. How do brands take that raw human vulnerability and turn it into a targeted incentive architecture? Let's look at why institutions actively default to the past, rather than trying to build the future.
What are the institutional incentives for deploying nostalgia so aggressively?
In modern, highly saturated markets, institutions are engaged in a brutal zero-sum battle for consumer attention and resources.
The primary institutional incentives for utilizing nostalgia are attention capture, trust transfer, brand differentiation, and loyalty formation.
When a brand utilizes a nostalgic appeal, it is heavily implying authenticity.
It is framing the past as a genuine, warm refuge from the artificiality of the modern world
The relentless fast pace.
and the cold digitization.
When you frame it as a search for authenticity, it changes how you view these campaigns. It means brands are actively inviting you, the listener, to treat their products, their sports franchises, and their corporate causes as identity storage.
They are essentially saying the modern world is scary and fake. Store your precious memories, your sense of tradition, and your authentic self right here inside our product.
Identity storage is the perfect conceptual lens for this. Think about the implications.
When a corporation successfully acts as a vault for your personal identity, the switching costs become impossibly high.
Moving to a competitor's product doesn't just feel like a change in consumer habit.
It feels like losing a piece of your own history.
But to engineer that kind of intense loyalty, institutions need to understand the variables of susceptibility. Not everyone reacts to an 80s synth pop song in a commercial the exact same way.
Who becomes persuadable, under what specific conditions, and why?
The research highlights several crucial moderating factors that dictate susceptibility.
One of the most significant variables is what the text calls tradition importance.
Consumers who place a high personal value on tradition. People who prioritize family rituals, historical continuity, and established social norms.
They find nostalgic advertisements significantly more believable and trustworthy than consumers who do not.
Because for them, the nostalgia cue aligns perfectly with their internal pre-existing value system. The brand is speaking their moral language.
That makes intuitive sense. If you value tradition, a traditional-looking ad works on you. But the research also dives into the behavioral side of susceptibility.
Specifically looking at prudence versus impulsivity. And this part surprised me.
You might naturally assume that nostalgia only appeals to careful, slow-moving traditionalists who like things the way they used to be.
But the data shows that highly impulsive behavior can actually be driven by nostalgia.
It is a counterintuitive but vital finding. A sudden, intense personal identification
Or a flash of deep empathy triggered by a nostalgic cue.
can lead directly to a highly impulsive purchase or a sudden charitable donation.
The emotional resonance of the memory is so strong that it overrides the prudent, deliberative decision-making process.
The consumer feels the emotion and acts immediately to capture or resolve that feeling.
The sources also break down susceptibility based on a person's self-concept, categorizing it into agentic versus communal needs. Can you explain how brands target those two different psychological profiles?
Certainly, individuals with an agentic focus are more self-oriented. Their psychological framework is organized around personal achievement, independence, and individual capability.
So when they encounter personal nostalgia, it fulfills a deep need for self-positivity.
It reminds them of their past victories, their youth, and their personal milestones.
So an ad targeting an agentic need might show a lone runner on a nostalgic misty morning, reminding the viewer of their own high school athletic glory.
Precisely. On the other hand, individuals with a communal focus are oriented outward.
Toward relationships, family, and community belonging.
For them, nostalgia fulfills a profound need for social connectedness. An advertisement targeting communal needs won't show a lone runner.
It will show a multi-generational family gathered around a table eating a traditional meal.
Institutions run sophisticated psychological profiles to tailor their messaging, highlighting either personal glory days or shared community heritage to perfectly align with these differing psychological needs.
When you look at it from the institution's perspective, it is completely obvious why they love this tactic.
Institutions hate risk. They prefer low-risk emotional templates.
Why would a company spend millions of dollars and risk complete public rejection to invent a completely new brand identity from scratch when they can just tap into a pre-existing, universally understood emotional reservoir?
It is the ultimate corporate risk mitigation strategy. The text provides a brilliant example of this with Moleskine notebooks.
Moleskine deliberately claims a lineage to the classic notebooks used by historical creative giants.
Ernest Hemingway, Bruce Chatwin, Pablo Picasso.
Which is an incredible positioning strategy. They are transferring the historical trust, the romanticized aura of the starving artist in Paris, and the undisputed authenticity of those legendary figures directly onto a modern mass-produced paper product.
It is a phenomenal low-risk way to manufacture instant brand heritage.
By connecting their modern product to the idealized past of artistic genius, they bypass the need to prove their value in the present.
They just borrowed the value from history.
So we have seen how the incentives are perfectly aligned for the institution to use this, and we see how the emotional hooks are set in the consumer's mind.
But what does this actually look like on the ground?
What are the measurable outcomes on human behavior?
The source text maps out predictable behavioral outcomes across three major, distinctly different domains.
Charitable giving, sports fandom, and sustainable food choices.
Let's begin with pro-social behavior, specifically focusing on charitable giving.
The research clearly demonstrates that inducing nostalgia significantly increases a person's willingness to donate money or time.
It operates through two distinct psychological channels: emotional utility and familial utility.
How do those two utilities differ in practice?
Emotional utility refers to the management of your own personal mood.
Experiencing a nostalgic longing can sometimes bring a mild feeling of sadness or a sense of loss for the past.
Donating to a charity in that moment makes you feel good. It provides a rush of present-day altruism that relieves the melancholy of the nostalgic longing.
It is a mood repair mechanism.
And familial utility is about honoring loved ones and maintaining the extended self.
If a charitable cause is directly relevant to a donor's family history,
Say, donating to a specific medical research charity because it relates to an illness a grandparent suffered from.
or donating to an old alma mater,
The nostalgia bridges the gap between passive empathy and active financial action.
it converts a backward glance at a loved one into present-day generosity.
That is a fascinating, largely positive outcome of this system. It generates actual funding for pro-social causes.
The second domain the text explores is sports fandom. And in the context of nostalgia, sports fandom behaves like a highly durable, almost unbreakable identity circuit.
The text examines season ticket sales and the massive industry of heritage sports tourism.
Think about the hundreds of thousands of people who travel to visit the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio.
Or the fans who travel to participate in traditional pond hockey tournaments in Canada.
For sports fans, nostalgia is a foundational driver of their consumption. But the effectiveness of nostalgic advertising in sports is heavily moderated by two factors.
The fans' ardency, meaning how deeply hardcore their fandom is, and the team's past performance.
The glory days effect. This is something I see all the time.
If a sports franchise is currently having a terrible season,
Or even a terrible decade.
reminding an ardent fan of a championship they won 20 years ago is a highly effective retention strategy.
It reduces the fans' present anxiety about the current losing streak and reinforces their deep-seated loyalty.
It goes back to the concept of identity storage. For an ardent fan, the team is a vault holding their childhood memories.
Their bonding experiences with their parents and their local civic pride.
The switching costs are astronomically high.
To abandon a struggling team and start cheering for a rival is not just changing a consumer preference to the fan, it feels like abandoning their own past.
Sports franchise, they expertly utilize retro marketing techniques.
Like wearing throwback uniforms from a championship era.
Or constantly highlighting historic anniversaries.
To keep that identity circuit closed, ensuring the fans' emotional and financial investment constantly circulates back to the franchise, regardless of current performance.
Now here is where the research gets incredibly tense.
We have talked about how nostalgia can make you generous to a charity or keep you relentlessly loyal to a sports team.
But the third domain the text covers is the sustainability tension. This is a critical friction point.
The text explicitly details how nostalgic cues can actively reduce a consumer's future-oriented intentions.
This is perhaps the most vital systemic insight in the entire analysis. Adopting innovative, green, or sustainable products fundamentally requires a future-oriented mindset.
To care about sustainability, you have to be cognitively focused on the long-term consequences of your actions on the environment and on future generations.
However, when an advertisement effectively leads an audience to dwell on the past, it temporarily hinders their cognitive ability to focus on the future.
Nostalgia, by its very definition, anchors your mental state in what is known, what is traditional, and what is comfortable.
Imagine the internal conflict this creates for a consumer. Let's say you were deeply moved by a nostalgic food advertisement.
The ad shows a traditional family recipe, maybe a classic heavy meat dish being served at a bustling, warm, beautifully lit family table from the 1970s.
You watch that, and you feel a profound connection to your own family history.
But then you walk into the grocery store and you are presented with a novel, plant-based, highly sustainable alternative to that exact food.
For a consumer who is currently anchored in that nostalgic mindset, choosing the novel, sustainable option does not feel like an act of ecological progress.
It feels like an identity loss.
It feels like a direct violation of the authenticity of their curated memory and a cold departure from comforting family traditions.
The nostalgic pull of the past acts as a powerful friction against the adoption of future-oriented, environmentally necessary innovations.
That friction is a huge structural roadblock for sustainability, and it leads directly into a broader, even more critical issue discussed in the text: the problem of problematic historical values.
The text imparts a very clear, impartial warning about the collateral damage of romanticizing history.
Harkening back to simpler times can inadvertently reinforce historical values that are deeply problematic in a modern context.
It is a structural hazard of the idealized past. If we look at actual recorded history, the past was frequently more overtly racist,
Structurally segregated.
homophobic, and patriarchal than the present.
The text points out that while modern society is certainly not free of prejudice, those prejudices were often much more open, blatant, and legally codified in the eras that marketers frequently mine for nostalgic aesthetics.
Nostalgia relies entirely on creating an idealized, safe past. But by romanticizing a specific era, let's say, utilizing a pristine 1950s suburban aesthetic to sell home goods,
Nostalgia can severely narrow our collective moral imagination.
a brand might just be using a familiar old doo-wop tune or visual cues from a classic black and white sitcom to evoke a vague sense of innocence and domestic stability.
But in doing so, they inadvertently tie their modern brand to the troublesome, exclusionary past values of that specific era.
The text is careful to note that this does not necessarily mean the brand or the marketing agency is intentionally endorsing any specific political or social viewpoint.
Rather, it is an unavoidable structural side effect of using an uncritical, highly romanticized version of history as a commercial template.
The process requires sanitizing the past, purposefully editing out the problematic truths, and ignoring historical injustices.
All to ensure the resulting emotion remains entirely safe for mass consumption.
So if nostalgia marketing has the power to actively suppress green innovation, and if it carries the structural risk of resurrecting problematic societal attitudes through sanitized history,
Why does it remain such a dominant, unshakable force in modern marketing?
this brings us to the persistence of the system. We need to look at the feedback loops and how institutions continuously reinforce this infrastructure.
Nostalgia marketing remains a dominant force. Precisely because its distortions are viewed as strengths in a volatile economic market?
We are currently living in an era defined by rapid cultural fragmentation and a fierce, exhausting competition for consumer attention.
Institutions are desperate for any semblance of reliability. Nostalgia works incredibly well because it functions as a stability narrative.
It cuts through the noise of a fragmented culture because it completely bypasses rational, deliberative thought and strikes directly at a deeply rooted, universal emotional baseline.
And once it strikes that baseline, it creates massive, self-reinforcing feedback loops.
If we trace the loop, it looks like this. An institution launches a successful nostalgic campaign. This familiar, comforting imagery leads to a massive spike in consumer engagement.
In our digital era, that engagement instantly triggers algorithmic amplification on platforms like social media and streaming services.
The internal metrics look fantastic to the corporate board, which inevitably results in the institution investing even more money into nostalgic creative campaigns next quarter.
Which ultimately leads to the widespread normalization of backward-facing identity cues across our entire culture.
The deeper the consumer's attachment grows to these nostalgic brands or tribes, the more responsive they become to future nostalgic appeals.
It is a closed-loop system of emotional extraction. The more we see it, the more we respond to it, and the more they build it.
Furthermore, the text highlights a fascinating phenomenon regarding how these loops are sustained. It is not just top-down corporate manipulation.
We see the rise of grassroots nostalgia loops.
Consumers themselves actively drive the persistence of these systems. We are not just passive recipients of this marketing.
We are eager, active participants in the infrastructure.
A prime example of this grassroots phenomenon detailed in the text is the story of Coca-Cola Surge.
Surge was a highly caffeinated neon green citrus soda that was extremely popular in the late 1990s but eventually discontinued.
It sat dormant, completely off the market, for 12 years.
But a dedicated group of consumers formed an organized movement on social media, relentlessly urging the company to bring it back.
They created a massive grassroots nostalgia loop. They weren't just asking for a beverage. They were demanding the return of a specific artifact from their youth.
Coca-Cola observed the massive algorithmic engagement generated by these fan groups,
Recognized the guaranteed built-in demand.
and resurrected the soda. When it relaunched, it sold out entirely within hours.
That example perfectly illustrates how consumer desire and institutional profit motives align to constantly resurrect the past.
And we see this dynamic permanently encoded into the very architecture of our digital spaces.
Consider phenomena like Throwback Thursdays on social media.
Or the endless viral stream of past-based internet memes referencing 90s cartoons or early 2000s fashion.
Our digital platforms are designed to algorithmically reward the emotional resonance of nostalgia.
The machine learning models quickly figure out that an image of a forgotten childhood toy generates significantly more likes, shares, and watch time than a post about a novel, complex future concept.
So the algorithm purposefully serves up more of the past. It takes nostalgia and makes it scalable, measurable, and infinitely repeatable across every single economic sector.
It is no longer just a clever advertising tactic used occasionally. Looking backward has become the default language of the internet.
Which brings us to the crucial interconnection of these nested systems. How does this localized marketing tactic plug into the global machinery of modern culture?
To fully understand this, we have to connect nostalgia marketing to the massive platform advertising economies
The production of cultural memory.
and the overarching need for institutional risk management.
When you zoom out and look at all these interconnected systems, it reveals a startling truth about how we see ourselves. Identity politics is increasingly taking on a consumer form.
What we choose to buy literally becomes a proxy for who we used to be and who we desperately want to be seen as.
Your consumption habits are no longer just a record of your purchases, they are being engineered into your autobiography.
And that realization is the crux of the systems level view. These macro systems jointly shape our perception of reality by treating human memory and the past itself as an extractive resource.
In the same way an industrial mining company extracts coal or lithium from the earth to power a city, modern consumer platforms extract your childhood memories.
They mine your emotional history, they monetize those feelings, and they govern the platforms where those memories are shared.
The past is no longer just a record of history. It has been transformed into a continuously harvested commodity used to fuel the global advertising economy.
It really has.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've traveled from Marcel Proust's positive quest for self-discovery to algorithms strip mining our childhoods for engagement metrics,
We've looked at how a desire for the 1950s can stall green innovation.
and how a retro notebook can borrow the ghost of Ernest Hemingway to mitigate corporate risk. So I have to ask you to pull all of this together for us, based on everything in this analysis.
Yes.
What is a crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception lies in a fundamental structural mismatch between how we privately experience nostalgia and how it is systematically deployed against us.
So what exactly is being misperceived?
The origin and the purpose of the emotion itself. We deeply misperceive our nostalgic feelings as personal, spontaneous emotional reactions to our own lived history.
When you see a retro advertisement or you feel the urge to buy a throwback sports jersey, you think you are simply reminiscing.
You believe you are the sole author of that warm, comforting feeling. But what is entirely obscured from the consumer's view is the vast, highly engineered persuasion infrastructure that actively curates, triggers, and harvests this emotion on a global scale.
If you only look at the surface interaction, you just see a fun commercial playing a song you loved in high school.
Because surface interpretation fails to see the systems at work, you miss the structural layer entirely. You miss how massive institutions are utilizing these low-risk emotional templates to manage their financial risk in saturated, highly competitive markets.
You miss how these constant backward-looking identity cues are actively creating friction, suppressing our collective ability to adopt future-oriented, sustainable innovations.
And crucially, you miss how the past is being meticulously edited and sanitized, omitting problematic historical truths, all for the sake of ensuring brand loyalty and generating predictable profit.
A systems-level analysis fundamentally changes our visibility.
It reveals that nostalgia is not merely a timeline of events, nor is it just a private personal memory.
It is a massive, engineered ecosystem designed specifically to convert your human search for meaning, belonging, and stability into predictable, recurring institutional power.
It really makes you rethink every commercial you see.
That is incredibly clarifying and honestly a bit haunting. It forces you to look at your own comforting memories in a completely different light. Which leaves me with a final thought I want you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your week. If our memories of the past are being so heavily curated and monetized by external systems simply to keep us comfortable in buying, what vital, necessary imaginations for our future are we willingly trading away in exchange for that comfort?
That's the real question.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.